Welcome to the Punishment in Society Digital Speaker Series. Punishment in Society is a collaborative research network, or CRN, of the Law and Society Association. You can find past DSS talks on our website. Today, we hear from Brenden Beck, who is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Colorado, Denver. He will be discussing, do austerity cut spare police budgets, recessions, and the budgetary shift from social services to law enforcement in US cities. At the end of the talk, we'll have some time for Q&A. You can put your question or name in the chat at any time to get a queue going, or you can raise your virtual hand during the Q&A period. As a reminder, we are recording this session, so if you do not want to be on camera, please feel free to post your question in the chat and I'll read it out loud. Before I turn it over to Brenden, I want to announce that our next installment of the Digital Speakers Series will feature Santhi Leon and Maggie Buckridge from the University of Delaware, presenting I'm Scared to Death to Try It on My Own, using iPoems to capture the complexities of religious support for people on the US Sex Offender Registry on December 8th at 12:30 Eastern Time. With that, I turn it over to you, Brenden.
Thanks so much, Ashley. Thanks to you all for coming. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A, so I'll make sure to leave plenty of time for that. Okay. So like Ashley said, the research I'm presenting today is called Do Austerity Cuts Spare Police Budgets? Fiscal Crises and the Shift from Social Services to Law Enforcement in the United States. And today's talk is going to have the following elements. I'm going to talk about what motivated it, what research questions came out of those motivations. I'm going to talk about something called welfare to carceral restructuring, what I mean by that, whether it's happening or not. Talk about the data I collected to try to address my research questions, the results I found, the conclusions I came up with, and then really looking forward to hearing from you all about thoughts and questions. This is a work in progress. I haven't submitted it, so very much welcome any feedback people have. The motivations for this talk were first and foremost the ongoing academic and political debates about welfare state retrenchment and police budgeting. So the academic debates about welfare state retrenchment, I'll talk about more in a second. Retrenchment just meaning contraction or decline. But I want to review the debates about police budgeting first. So here's a quote from the Movement for Black Lives vision statement from 2016. They wrote, quote, "We demand the reallocation of funds from police and punitive school discipline practices to restorative services." Right? And so this movement that would get called defund in the summer of 2020, defund the police in the summer of 2020, as this date points out, and as we all know, that demand predated 2020. And these calls for budget reallocation on the part of cities are quite long-standing. On the other side of the ledger, we have people like President Biden who've called to fund the police, as he announced in his State of the Union speech earlier this year. So we have these two sides of the debate, and whatever we think about defunding the police, whether we think it's a good idea, a terrible idea, a good idea with a bad slogan attached, I think we can all agree that we want a strong evidence base to understand where municipal budgeting has been going and where it might go next. So I see today's research project very much as a prehistory of defund the police. Where have municipal budgets been and where might they go? Another motivation for this project was research showing the positive impacts of city services like libraries, parks, daycare centers, and housing. Here's the cover of Eric Kleineberg's book, Palaces for the People. And in it, he shows the incredible impacts that libraries can have on reducing crime, on improving educational outcomes for children that use the libraries, for improving well-being and social cohesion in the neighborhoods where those libraries are, right? We know from many meta-analyses that parks and green space reduce violence. Mario Small's work tells us that daycare centers and community centers provide really vital hubs of organizational and civic connection in neighborhoods that often lack them. There's no silver bullet in public policy, but if there were, it would probably be housing, right? People that have a stable home are less likely to commit crime, they have better health, they have better wages and employment outcomes. And so these sort of local municipal services don't get talked about as much as the big federal programs like SNAP or Social Security or Medicaid. And that's understandable because those big social services at the federal and state level are much more expensive and account for a lot more money than local social services. But I want to revive this attention to the local social service program because I think it has a huge potential to create benefits as this research shows. And as the federal government is spending less on things like housing, responsibility for these sort of social services are devolving down to local governments. And so we'll need to understand what's happening with them and where they're going next. I'm also motivated by research showing that cities that spend more on social services spend less on criminal justice. There does seem to be in the research this trade-off where you have more of one, you have less of the other, but we don't know much about the trajectory of the two or what sort of context shifts this transition from what Loïc Vicant calls the left hand of the state, the social service, education, welfare component of the state, to the right hand of the state, the criminal justice, police, courts, and prisons hand of the state. So that led me to these three research questions. First, did local government spending in the US shift from social services to police following the fiscal austerity of the 1980s? This is a purely descriptive question. I'm not asking a how or a why. I just want to know, did this transition happen? And I locate the 1980s as an important pivot point for reasons I'll talk about here in a second. Spoiler alert, I found that it very much does, that local government spending shifted away from social services and towards policing in the past 30 years. So that's a descriptive question. Did this thing happen? Did this transfer happen? My second research question is more analytic. It asks, what role do recurrent fiscal crises play in such a shift? So if funding is shifting away from social services and towards police in US municipalities, what might be the context of that shift? What's causing that shift? And I suspect that recurrent fiscal crises, meaning the perpetual cash strappedness of cities, is going to be a key moment when we can observe this transition, observe this realignment. And so by fiscal crisis, I just mean a revenue decline or a loss in revenue. And spoiler alert on this, I find that these are key moments. Indeed, revenue declines accelerate the shift from social services to policing. Third, I'm curious about which local government functions are cut the most during austerity. So disaggregating social services, and I'll talk more of what I mean about social services here in a second, but I want to know, is it libraries that are getting cut more than parks? Is it housing that's getting cut less than healthcare and public assistance? Once we split up social services, what kind of cuts are we seeing? What kind of austerity cuts are we seeing? Where are they concentrated? Okay, what do I mean by this idea of welfare to carceral restructuring? Well, there was a shift in the mid-20th century from social provision to criminal justice. A lot of people have written about this. Elizabeth Hinton's great book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, locates LBJ, the Johnson administration, as a key fulcrum around which US, at least federal policy in the US, shifted from the Keynesian New Deal, big welfare state project of the early 20th century to the neoliberal Nixonian, Reaganite transition to laissez-faire government, free markets, and neoliberalism. So she locates the Johnson administration as a key pivot point. And here we see Johnson signing the Safe Streets Act of 1968. Jonathan Simon, Ruthie Gilmore, Loïc Vicant have all written about this transition, at least at the state and federal level, and at least it was a rhetorical transition. We'll see here in a second if it actually happened. But this rhetorical transition away from government should provide services to government should provide public safety and criminal justice, right? Okay, just in case there's any historians on the Zoom, I should come clean. This is not a picture of LBJ signing the Safe Streets Act. I couldn't find that. This is a picture of him signing some highway bill. But I do like, I don't know if you can tell, but Lady Bird Johnson's breaking the fourth wall there and staring at the camera. So one reason to investigate the empirics of this question is that the extent of welfare to carceral restructuring is empirically underexamined, especially in cities. These theorists have all pointed to rhetorical and sometimes legal shifts from social services and towards criminal justice. But the reality on the ground is often that welfare state programs are very hard to retract. We saw this with George W. Bush when he tried to privatize Social Security. He couldn't do it. When Trump, with a Republican Congress, tried to end the Affordable Care Act, he couldn't do it, right? Despite a lot of attempts by right-wing Reaganite and free market political officials, welfare state programs prove pretty durable. And research has found this. Research has found that welfare state retrenchment, meaning decline, is often overstated. That once these welfare programs are in place, it's hard to get rid of them. So I want to examine this question, not at the state and federal level where it's been most examined, but at the local level where I think it might be even clearer. Of course, carceral state growth, prisons, courts, and police, that's unambiguous. The 20th century saw a huge increase in the number of people incarcerated. As some other research I've done has shown, police budgets grew through the end of the 20th century and the early 21st, right? So if we're looking at how welfare state and carceral state functions trade off with one another, right? The welfare state story is a little ambiguous. The carceral state story is much clearer. There was huge growth in the carceral state during this time. And I think it's going to be really important to analyze social services and criminal justice together, because analyzing them in isolation, which is what welfare state scholars have done, and even some carceral state scholars have done, analyzing them in isolation is not going to provide a full picture. These two functions are trading off with one another, are substituting for one another, and so we need to analyze them together. Okay, so that's about my descriptive question. Was this transition happening? I also have an analytic question, which is, what is the role of fiscal crises? During revenue shortfalls, will police spending fall or will it grow? Hadir Avaram, Armando Laramian, Heather Schoenfeld have all speculated that during budgetary contractions, during revenue shortfalls, criminal justice functions will be cut like any other function. During, the austerity cuts come for everyone. During belt tightening, police and prisons and courts will not be spared. And they attribute this to just the material reality of there being less money, but they also attribute it to a shift in conservative politics starting in the late 90s, early 2000s. This idea that conservatives started to see criminal justice budgets as another example of big government profligacy and overspending. And so the right, and this is exemplified by groups like Right on Crime, Grover Norquist, the big tax cutter, Newt Gingrich, and others started to look at criminal justice budgets and say, these have gotten too big. We small government conservatives need to team up with the criminal justice liberals and try to cut these budgets. And so Avaram and Schoenfeld and others have speculated that this alliance of criminal justice reform liberals and small government conservatives would lead to an even further contraction of the carceral state. On the other hand, a group of people expect that during revenue shortfalls, police spending will grow. Stuart Hall, Ruthie Gilmore, and others have talked about how when there's recessions and economic crises that often precipitate fiscal crises, revenue shortfalls, the state is going to need to reassert itself. It lost its social service legitimacy, but it retained its crime control legitimacy. So local governments, state governments, and the federal governments are going to reassert that crime control power, that policing and incarceration power during crises to try to make up for that loss of legitimacy. So there's these two camps. Police spending will fall or grow during revenue shortfalls. I'm going to chart sort of the middle path. And my argument is that because policing is venerated as the essential municipal service, city leaders will revert to protecting this first function, to borrow a term from Naomi Murakawa, and shield police budgets during recurrent fiscal crises. So I suspect that because policing is seen as the most important, the most primary, the most core municipal government function, that both Democrats and Republicans will revert to this first principle during budget shortfalls. And that during these fiscal crises, we'll see an acceleration of movement away from social services and towards policing, even, indeed, especially in democratic cities. And I wanted to know more about I'm a quantitative sociologist, but I wanted to know more about the qualitative description that mayors and city council members provide when they cut budgets, right? What is the thinking they're going through? So I did some archival newspaper research and looked for journalistic accounts of budget cuts during fiscal crises. And I'm going to include one of those here. This is going to be a quote from a New Albany city council member. Here he is with two of his colleagues. New Albany is a suburb of Louisville, Kentucky. And in 2009, during the heart of the Great Recession, he put it this way, quote, "I don't know how we can ever have a balanced budget without doing something drastic. Pretty soon we're going to be down to police and fire and nothing else." Right, so this, I think, exemplifies the mayor and city council logic that even when you're making drastic cuts, you don't cut police. They're a primary core function, and so we have to shield police. And I suspect this will happen in all sorts of cities. Okay, to try to address this research question, I collected the following data. I collected data on 515 US municipalities that had more than 50,000 people, with annual data from 1990 to 2019. That generated about 13,000 city years. So my observation for the multivariate analysis will be those city years. I also collected data on 150 what are called fiscally standardized cities. These are cities for a shorter number of years. These are cities that a group called the Lincoln Institute has collapsed all local government spending in a geographic area. I'll talk about this more in a second, but for instance, school districts. A school district might overlap several cities, or a county might encompass many cities. And so we want to know, all right, not just what is the municipal government spending in that geographic city, but what are the county, school district, and special district expenditures in those geographic cities as well. And so I'm going to use a data set that includes school district spending as well. The sources for my data were the annual survey of local government finances, this FISC data set that I just talked about from the Lincoln Institute, the FBI, UCR provides crime data, and the census and the American Community Survey provide demographic data. The outcomes I'm interested in understanding are inflation-adjusted spending on police and social services. What do I mean by social services? I mean these 6 functions: healthcare, hospitals, housing and community development, parks and rec, libraries, and public assistance. So when I talk about social services today, these are the 6 categories I mean. Happy to talk more in the Q&A if people are curious about what's under the hood in each of these 6 categories. But I know what you might be thinking. What about schools? What about schools? What about schools? Those are by far the biggest part of any local government expenditure. It comes from school districts, not municipalities, right? So in most cities, a few cities run their schools through their city government, but most cities it's going to be run through a school district. So if we're talking about the welfare to carceral transition, the social service to police transition, should we include school districts? Because a school district couldn't move money to or from the police budget, even if it wanted to. Similarly, most municipal governments can't move money to or from the school budget, even if they wanted to. So does it make sense if we're talking about a transition to include that? I would argue no, but I still want to understand education spending because it's such a large part of local government spending. So I do analyze education spending as well, but I separate that out from social services. Okay, what did I find? I found that municipal government spending evinces realignment. This is a graph of the expenditure per capita in the median city of the 515 that I have data on. So the black line represents police spending in that typical city. The blue line represents social service spending in that typical city. The vertical axis is dollars per capita, and the horizontal axis is year. So in the typical city, they spent $200 per resident on police in 1990. That number grew very steadily until the Great Recession. There was a small dip, and then it recovered in about 2015, such that in 2019, the typical city spent more on police than any previous year. Police growth was about 50%, right? It went from $200 to about $300 in this 30 years. Social services display a different trend. Social services almost keep up with policing in the 1990s. Social service spending really plateaus in the 2000s. And then after the Great Recession, social service spending never rebounded. Between 1990 and 2019, social services only grew about 24%, so half as much as police spending grew during the same time. So I would argue this evinces that restructuring, that realignment away from social services and towards policing. I don't think it's drastic or vast, but it is gradual and steady, right? And if this trend continues, we'll see an even further divergence of social service spending from police spending. Okay, so that's one way to look at spending. And I would argue that police spending growing twice as fast as social service spending indicates a transition from the welfare state to the carceral state at the local level. But we might look not just at what cities spend, but what local residents receive from all local governments. So this next graph is going to include all local government spending. So now I'm bringing in that school district spending. I'm bringing in sheriff spending at the county level. And this is for a smaller subset of cities and a fewer number of years, because the Lincoln Institute used that fiscally standardized city process where they say, okay, if say Newark, New Jersey is 35% of Essex County, we're going to assume that 35% of Essex County's sheriff budget was spent in Newark, right? It's an assumption, but it's the best accounting we have if we want to include school district money, especially because school districts are so important. So if a school district covers 2 cities and one city has 40% of the school-aged children, the FISC's data set will assume that 40% of that school district's money was spent in the city. Okay, if we include education, what do we see? We see the same realignment, but at different absolute values. So this graph now includes education spending with social service spending. And we see that once you include K through 12 education, that accounts for a much bigger amount of expenditure than police spending. Social services plus education is about 10 times more than police spending. However, you notice these 2 lines are converging. Police spending grew about 40% during this time. Social service and education spending together only grew 20%. So we're seeing, even though it's at a different absolute value, social services and education are more than policing now, they're converging, which means this trend is still happening even when we include school budgets. Municipalities and school districts are spending less on education. Shouldn't say moving money because they can't, it's the school district and the municipality are separate. But rather, to say differently, municipalities and school districts are spending less on education and they're spending more on police relative to 1990. So we still see the same restructuring. Okay, so those are 2 different ways to measure government spending, and they show the same trend, a move away from social services and towards policing. Just to bring in a third metric, we could look at spending relative not to the number of residents in a city, but relative to the need that city is experiencing. And this is a way of measuring government spending that comes out of the welfare state literature. It says, don't look at per capita spending, look at spending relative to poverty. So the next graph I'm going to put up looks at police spending per violent crime, and social service spending per family in poverty. And of course, these 2 numbers are now on a different scale, so we can't compare them. So we'll just be looking at their growth. And here this displays an even stronger trend. So now the vertical axis is not dollars per capita, but it's percent change since 1990. We've forced both of these to be 0 in 1990, and we're just going to look at how they've changed since then. And we see a really astronomical growth of police spending when we benchmark it per violent crime. Police spending grew by about 150% during this time relative to the amount of crime. Of course, everyone on this call probably knows violent crime was going down and police spending was going up during this time. We saw the police spending increase on that first graph, and we know that violent crime was decreasing during this time. And we can argue, and many people have, about the extent to which the numerator police spending was responsible for pushing down the denominator violent crime. But leaving that disagreement aside, what we can see is that social service spending does not display the same relationship to its need that police spending does. Police spending goes up even when the need for it goes down. Social service spending tracks much more closely to the need for it. This is social service spending per family in poverty, and it hovered really close to 0. It didn't grow at all, except for a few years in the 2000s there, since 1990. So these are 3 different ways of measuring social service and police spending, and they all show the same trend, a move away from social services and towards policing. Okay, what about my analytic question? What's the role of fiscal crises and revenue shortfalls in expediting or slowing down this realignment from social services towards policing? So for these multivariate models, I'm interested in the same outcomes, police spending and social spending. The explanatory variable that I'm most interested in is revenue decline. So I look at the total revenue for a city, and I just isolate the years that revenue declined. This is called decomposing the variable into its asymmetric parts. So I'm decomposing total revenue into one variable called revenue decline and one variable called revenue increase. So it'll capture these revenue decline variables will only capture shortfalls, because I suspect that what's happening during budget shortfalls, fiscal crises, will be different than what happens during budget windfalls and accelerating revenue. This includes government transfers from federal and state governments. It includes all municipal tax revenue, and it includes revenue from fines and fees. So a big part, about 40% of most cities' budget, are intergovernmental transfers. And the biggest part of that is from the federal government. So the federal government, shows up in this story. I said earlier that this is a local government story. That's partly true. But the federal government shows up in the way that it funds municipal governments. So if the federal government gave, say, Denver a $4 million grant to hire more police officers, that'll show up in this revenue variable. And this helps me capture some of what's happening at the federal level. And I can talk about my results that I ran excluding intergovernmental transfers and what that might tell us if people are curious. I control for the violent crime rate, economic disadvantage, race, ethno-racial demographics, age, and housing characteristics as well. So I estimated what are called dynamic panel models. So this just means that it's a longitudinal or over time regression analysis. Dynamic means that I include a lagged dependent variable. So I include the past versions of police spending and social spending on the right side of the equation, because these are incredibly path dependent phenomenon, right? Cities don't start from scratch when they're coming up with a budget. They take the previous year's budget, they basically white out the date, and they start from there. And so we need to control for that inertia in order to isolate, all right, what's just the impact of this year's fiscal crisis? So I use dynamic panel models to do that. Again, like I said before, I use asymmetric changes in total revenue. So I isolate revenue decline from revenue increase. I use a first differencing procedure, which means I'm not looking at the value of police spending or social service spending in any one year, but I look at the difference between 2 years. So how did it change? This does a few things. It removes big time trends, so we can just isolate what's happening in that year. And it also controls for any time invariant characteristics. So things like the unique history of a city, what functions, social service and otherwise, it's in charge of, that'll all be controlled for so long as it didn't change during the study window. I took the natural logarithm of all the variables. This does a few things. It normalizes the data, it pulls in outliers. It also helps us compare across models, which I'll be doing here in a second. And then I included year fixed effects as well. Okay, what did I find? So here, I'm gonna put up a plot that's the coefficient estimates for 2 different models. A model of police spending, where police spending is the outcome, and a model where social service spending is the outcome. And here are those coefficient estimates represented as dots. So the black dot, and I'll zoom in here in a second if this is hard to read. So the black dots are police spending models of police spending, and the blue dot shows the model of social service spending. And the confidence bars represent 95% confidence. Okay, let's zoom in on our explanatory variable of interest, which is revenue decrease. What do we see? Okay, we see, and I logged the variables so we can interpret these coefficients as what's called an elasticity, basically just a percent change. So what happens when a city decreases its revenue by 1%, or when it sees a 1% revenue decline? It cuts police budgets, this black dot, it cuts police budgets about 0.1 or 0.2%. So a 1% decline in total revenue is related to a 0.1% decline in police spending. But we see a much bigger decline in social service spending, represented by this blue dot. So a 1% decline in total revenue is related to a over 0.5% decline in, and we see that here, right? These are the negative sides of the ledger, a 0.5% decline in social service spending. So social service spending is cut over 3 times more than police spending during fiscal crises. So this provides evidence for my argument that fiscal crises, these budget shortfalls, are going to be moments in which the welfare to carceral realignment accelerates. We see a broader spread between social spending and police spending. We can also look, this looks at revenue shortfalls. We can also look at revenue windfalls. And that's what this next variable looks at, right? I decomposed revenue into 2 different variables. So this is the second one. So what we see here is during a revenue increase, cities spend more on police. And indeed, they spend more on social services than even they spend on police, but they don't spend enough on social services to make up for the sharp cuts that social services experience during shortfalls. So during shortfalls, social services get cut deeply, and during budget windfalls, they don't get replaced to nearly the same levels, right? This coefficient 0.3 is about half of the coefficient during cuts. So indeed, we see an asymmetric relationship. When budgets are tight, social services get cut a lot. When budgets are fat, they don't get replaced to the same level. The rest of these variables, there's not a lot of action here. We see the lag, the Bennett variable, is positive and statistically significant because these are incredibly path dependent inertial processes. Violent crime increases both budget areas a little bit. Economic disadvantage decreases police spending. Cities that see an increase in Black people spend more on both police and social services. Not a lot of other statistically significant coefficients here. Okay, so maybe this finding of mine that cuts are deeper for social services during budget shortfalls than for police was an artifact of the way I modeled something or the consequence of the sample I chose. But I found that the results are robust to alternate specifications. So the next plot I'm going to put up just isolates that revenue decline coefficient, and it reruns the models on 9 different modeling specifications. And I don't need to bore you with all these different specifications, but basically we see the same pattern in each specification. So for instance, if we look just at regular fixed effects models, not the dynamic panel models, we still see that social services are cut more than police. If we look at spending from all local governments, so if we include that education spending, we still see that social services are cut more than police. Interestingly, the 100 largest cities, if we just restrict the sample to the 100 largest cities, social services and policing aren't cut at a statistically significantly different level. That the blue coefficient and the black coefficient representing social services and policing are both within the confidence intervals of one another. But when we look at all but the 100 largest cities, we see a much bigger cut. So in these mid-sized cities, which are about 50,000 to 180,000 people, we see that social service cuts are almost 1-to-1. When there's a 1% decline in revenue, social services get cut almost a 1% as well. And we might expect that, right? Small cities have less of a rainy day fund. There's less of a budgetary buffer to sort of ride out these revenue shortfalls. But that means that our findings are being driven by these mid-sized cities, not by large cities. Okay, I can also disaggregate these results by social service function, each of them on their own. So I'm going to pull apart libraries, hospitals, healthcare, public assistance, et cetera, and look to see, all right, during a 1% decline in total revenue, what happens to each social service function? And I find that parks and housing are cut the most. So again, we see policing is cut about 0.1%, same coefficient as we saw from that first plot, during a 1% revenue decline. And again, these coefficients are just for revenue decline, though I did include all the control models for these 7 models. Public assistance, libraries, and hospitals and healthcare, their coefficient estimates are all deeper, are all more negative than police spending. But because the 95% confidence bands include the police cuts, we can't say for sure that public assistance, libraries, hospitals, or healthcare are cut more than police during revenue shortfalls. Where we really see the deepest austerity cuts is parks and rec and housing and community development. Those figures both are outside the confidence interval for policing, so we can be assured that there are deeper cuts to parks and rec and housing and community development than there are to police budgets during this time. Right? My talk title is called "Do Austerity Cuts Spare Police Budgets?" And what these results show is, well, not completely, right? Police budgets do get cut during austerity cuts, during budget shortfalls, but they don't get cut nearly as deeply as parks and rec spending and housing and community development spending. And this housing coefficient is really interesting because a lot of research has shown that cities are increasingly responding to housing and homelessness with police. I've got a paper with Adam Goldstein about how cities that saw a bigger reliance on housing market growth before the Great Recession spent more on police. We suspect because cities are trying to protect this housing value, trying to keep crime rates low to keep housing values high. Right? Chris Herring and Forrest Stewart and others have shown how police are increasingly the first line response to homelessness, that we're not addressing homelessness with a housing first response, but with a criminal justice response. And so I think what this plot represents is that transition away from housing and towards policing to solve social problems. Okay, finally, I want to look at political partisanship. I suspect that there's going to be bipartisan cuts, that Democratic cities and Republican cities will see the same thing during revenue shortfalls, because there's this taken for granted assumption that policing is the dominant, important, primary municipal function. It's not about political ideology. It's just about this widespread so-called common sense belief, right? And so I want to disaggregate. I want to split the samples into two subsamples, just Democratic cities and just Republican cities. And what I see when I do that is that Republican cities cut police more than Democratic cities during budget shortfalls. So these first, and again, these are just the coefficient for revenue decline, but the models include all the controls. So in Democratic cities, of which there were 391 in my sample, we see that social service cuts are much deeper than police cuts in Democratic cities. Police budgets barely get touched in Democratic cities during austerity. In Republican cities, we see a very different pattern. Republicans cut police and social services both equally, right? These confidence intervals show that there's no statistically significant difference between how Republican cities cut police budgets and cut social service budgets, right? So this shows that it shows that social cuts are bipartisan, right? Both Democratic and Republican cities cut. Oh, and I should have mentioned, the way I'm measuring Democratic and Republican is the share of their vote in the 2016 presidential election. So in Democratic cities and in Republican cities, social services are the first to go out the door when revenue declines. But only in Democratic cities do they shield police budgets. So there's this idea out there that fiscally conservative Republicans are teaming up with criminal justice reformers to try to cut criminal justice budgets, right? And we see that happening in Republican cities already, right? Over the past 30 years, Republican cities have been cutting police and social services equally. But we haven't seen that bleed over into Democratic cities yet. Democratic cities are still very much preserving police budgets and cutting social service budgets during revenue declines. Okay, just to recap what I found. Police spending grew 2 times as fast as social spending between 1990 and 2019, indicative of a slow, steady welfare to carceral restructuring. So some people, some theorists and researchers expected to see a huge shift away from the welfare state and towards the carceral state during the end of the 20th century. Jonathan Simon called this realignment vast, right? In that first graph, I don't see the case for a vast restructuring, but in some ways, this slow and steady realignment is going to be more difficult to reverse if people are interested in reversing it. And I should note, he was talking about the federal government and I'm looking at the local government. So it could still very well be true at that scale. I also found that restructuring accelerated during fiscal crises. Social services were cut over 3 times more than police when revenue declined. So this is a key moment. This budgetary realignment that's happening away from welfare functions and towards police is accelerating during budget shortfalls. So if a policymaker or a social movement wants to move money either from police or towards police, this moment of fiscal crisis is going to be a really key moment to do that. That's when this realignment has been accelerating. And this is likely due to the widely held assumptions about policing's primacy, not a loss of state legitimacy or conservative political shift. So some theories speculate that it's about when the state will lose legitimacy and they'll have to reassert policing. I didn't see any sharp spikes that would suggest it was economic crises or a rupture of hegemonic power that was leading to this realignment. Nor did I see any evidence that it was a conservative political shift where fiscal conservatism was trickling over into democratic cities. So I think it's more about these bipartisan, widely held assumptions that policing is the core municipal function that accounts for this realignment. And this restructuring likely has consequences for crime, poverty, and police outcomes. We defunded social services in this country starting in the 2000s. Of course, that didn't receive nearly as many headlines as the supposed police defunding has received over the past 2 or 3 years, right? And I think that this defunding of social services and a continued funding of policing likely is going to impact crime. I worry that we're sacrificing any short-term gains we might be winning by spending money on police. We're going to be losing in the long term because we're defunding social services. We're not addressing the root causes of crime. So I speculate that this realignment that we've seen over the past 30 years is going to have consequences for crime. My next research project after this one is to use what's called an instrumental variable approach, using exogenous shocks based on federal grants to cities to try to study how allocations to social services or policing impacts crime in the long term. So this will be my next step of research, looking at how this restructuring has impacted crime and poverty, right? If we're spending less on social services, we might expect that will increase the poverty rate. I also think that police arrest rates and police killings might accelerate as these police budgets grow. So that's some future work that I'll be working on. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So if people can join me in a virtual round of applause for that excellent talk. Yay. Okay, so we have some time for Q&A. As a reminder, we are recording. So if you don't want to be on camera, please feel free to post your questions in the chat. Let's see. So I'll give people a minute to either raise your virtual hand or put a question in the chat. Oh, Brett, please go for it.
Okay, hi. Thanks, Brenden. That was really interesting. Two questions. One is about some of the graphics that you displayed, and just as a descriptive matter, some of the initial trends. I think in your first graph, you showed the median trend lines over time. And I'm just curious if you see any evidence of different shapes in those trends. So in other words, maybe there are different classes of cities that are kind of moving and responding to these shocks in different ways that maybe isn't captured in the regression results. The second thing I wanted to ask about is a potential role for police unions in kind of bolstering and protecting those policing budgets. It occurs to me that maybe that is why you're not seeing police cuts in those democratic cities as much. Maybe there's stronger union presence there.
Yeah, great questions. Thanks so much. Yeah, as far as the class of cities goes, I haven't broken it up too much. I think those descriptive trend lines are limited in that they don't control for things like different crime rates, different poverty levels, different funding structures, different tax bases. And so, I worry if we start breaking them up too much, will be things that we think are attributable to, like if we were to separate, wealthy cities from lower income cities, things we might be attributing to income would actually be a crime effect. And so I'd want to sort of not break them up too much, but there are there's definitely some processes like latent class analysis and trajectory analyses that could try to look for some different classes. So that's a great idea. And I've written down trajectory analysis ? To try to look into that. So great idea. As far as unions go, I would suspect that any city, and can correct me if I'm wrong, I would suspect that any city that has a police union is also going to have a strong public employee union in the housing and parks department as well. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe police unions, and I need to look into this more, but maybe police unions are strong in some cities, even when other social service unions aren't strong. So I would suspect that unions aren't going to see a big effect, but the Law Enforcement Management and Administration Survey has a question on unions, so that'd be easy enough to pull in and analyze. I would be interested to see if that's what's making it more durable in Republican cities, but in Democratic cities rather. But again, we're not seeing that same durability in other public sectors. So I would suspect that public sector unions are uniform, but that I don't know. Good, great question.
Awesome. Other questions? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and jump in the queue. Oh, no, Aaron, go for it, please.
Thanks, Ashley. Brenden, terrific talk. I really appreciate it. And I have a question for you, but I have to ask with a little bit of apology. I had to run out for about 5 minutes to deal with a student and come back. So if I'm asking a question, I'm ignorant because I missed part of it. Please just tell me and don't waste everyone's time. But I'm fascinated. And I'm curious about whether or not you looked into whether the not just the overall social spending, but and not just decline during recession time, but did the type of social spending change over time, right? So I love the graph you had about how during hard recession or hard times, which avenues decline. But is it the case that over this period of time, when we have what I found to be a surprising growth in social spending, that it was increasingly control-oriented welfare state types of spending? So there's still this dispersion away from maybe libraries and towards police athletic centers or so on.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I mean, so we saw a pretty similar trend across all 6 of the categories of social services. So I don't think any one is accounting for that huge, or not that huge, but the relatively smaller growth of social services relative to policing. But your point about, do we see more control-oriented social services, is a good one, right? Forrest Stewart's work, Chris Herring's work, and others have shown that even, and Armando Laramian has a great ethnography about how hospitals are increasingly becoming carceral, that they're enforcing rules, they're allocating care based on criminal justice ideals. And so we start to see this merging of criminal justice functions and social service functions, where the police are providing social services and social services are starting to resemble police. And that I unfortunately won't be able to capture. If the housing authorities police are arresting more people, that might be in the housing authorities budget item, and so it might look like housing spending, but it's actually police spending. So that's a great point, and I think a good limitation to point out about my project is that if this bleeding, this merging of functions between police and social services is really huge, I'm not going to capture that. So that's a good caveat. But yeah, the trends in all 6 social service areas display a pretty similar path. And I shared your surprise about the growth in social services, that if you just looked at social services, you would see an increase in spending over these 30 years. And that's why it's important to put it in the context of police spending, because it hasn't been as, the growth hasn't been as extreme as policing has.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, Cameron, you're next.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. My name is Cameron Okeke. I am a senior program associate at the Vera Institute of Justice, and I work in the Louisiana office, and we are seeing this happen in real time. And I'm curious about, knowing that we just had this kind of like historic infusion of money with the American Rescue Plan dollars, and we're watching in real time as like headline after headlines like, oh, people aren't spending as much money American Rescue dollars on social services that we thought, and that a lot of it's going towards policing. That is actually what I'm literally working on at this exact moment, is trying to categorize the different expenditures. And so I'm curious if you have a plan or any insight on this. We are kind of at another junction point where there's massive federal dollars coming in, but during a period of austerity. So Louisiana is seeing this happen in real time. Yeah,
great question. I mean, I think the CARES Act money will be a really interesting moment to observe this, and if there's if there's one thing that's going to affect or shift municipal budgets, it can often be federal funding. And so I think it'd be really interesting to look at, and if there's any graduate students on the call, maybe consider this, really interesting to look at, where did cities spend their CARES Act money? Did they spend it on housing or did they spend it on policing? That would be the brief look that I took at the CARES Act accounting, is that the categories are pretty broad. Cities said things like public safety or public welfare. And so it might be hard to categorize exactly where those dollars ended up. But this huge infusion of federal dollars is going to go somewhere: police, social services, transportation, et cetera. And tracking where that money goes and how that shifts municipal budgets could be really fascinating. I think, I suspect, based on this research, that federal funding will actually help social services more than it'll help police. If you noticed in that sensitivity analysis plot that I showed, I looked just at the effect of local government own source revenue on expenditures. So I dropped out intergovernmental transfers from the feds and the state, and there I found an even stronger realignment. Social services got cut even more. So it looks like the federal grants in the form of housing assistance and rental assistance grants and healthcare grants and things like that to cities might actually be decelerating the welfare to carceral transition. So my sort of back of the envelope hypothesis would be that the CARES Act is, if anything, going to make municipal budgets more social service forward. But that's an empirical question, and one we'll definitely have to watch.
Awesome. Other questions? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead or sorry, no, Alexia, you go ahead.
Yeah, I was really curious if maybe there's a way that you can talk about what is happening in Democratic areas based off of like rhetoric from like the 80s and 90s, right? Like the tough on crime type rhetoric. And if there's a way that you can potentially capture that through like archival research, or if there's a way that that might, show up in like quantitative analysis. But I'm kind of wondering if maybe there's like a way that we can look at that effect, and if that kind of spills over and continues to spill over in those areas, and then bleeds into things like municipal spending at the local level as well within these areas.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, I think the tough on crime rhetoric is probably showing sort of the early days of the Democratic city commitment to police spending, and for all the supposed soft on crime aspects of democratic cities, my research and Naomi Murakawa's research and others have shown that Democrats are often just as punitive as Republicans, especially at the city level. So, I think that pivot moment in the 80s and 90s that you're talking about, we might very well see something different before the 80s, right? Maybe democratic cities were much more social service forward and less police forward. So I think that's a great question. As far as archival research goes, yeah, I mean, it's not my forte, so I'll leave it to some of our qualitative friends on the call. But I suspect that the quote that I found from the New Albany City Council person is pretty representative. That going back many years, local government officials see policing as this service that needs protection first and foremost, and so social services get cut first and most, and police cuts happen last and least. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks.
Awesome. Other questions? Okay, now I'm going to jump in the queue. So I'm glad Alexia asked about the question about the kind of soft on crime, tough on crime Democrats thing, because that's kind of what I was thinking about. Is like, to me, this is very much about legitimacy when you show that there's like the Democrat cities are not cutting the police budget, because they kind of can't. Like they'll look like they're soft on crime, they'll be reifying that stereotype, and I kind of think of that's like what Biden's doing right now. There's this big defund the police. It's not popular with moderates. He wants the moderates. And so he has to bend over backwards looking like he's tough on crime, and not part of what, the moderates are seen as like the crazy wing of the Democratic Party. And so I kind of wonder how much that's going on. But different point that I wanted to make, I was thinking about kind of your framing about this, and like the different narratives about the kind of changes to the welfare state and the kind of punitive, kind of the welfare punitive trade-off and all that. And I was thinking there's kind of a third narrative involved that I can't quite wrap my head around how it would fit with what's going on. But it's basically I'm most associated with Garland and that 1996 article that's also a chapter in his book about the limits of the sovereign state, and this kind of recognition of, after decades of this high crime kind of rate that comes down in the early 1990s, there's kind of this sense of like, yeah, the government can't keep you safe. Sorry, you're going to have to engage in responsibilization. It's your job now to keep yourself safe. So you need to get, your home alarm, you need to get your car alarm. If you can afford it, get private security. You need to be on the lookout when you're on the street, and that sort of kind of approach to like, basically the police is there after the crime has happened to like come and maybe investigate or at least take a report, but we're not really there to actually keep you safe. And then I was also kind of thinking about the role of, I don't know if you would have any data on like private security, or if like how that would possibly come up, but if there are any places where like perhaps state or city budgets could like cut police because they know that people are taking over private security or something like that. Like I can't imagine that's a huge part of the trend, but I was wondering about private security in this, but more generally just that kind of like responsibilization of like, okay, so we can't do it, so you guys are going to have to do it. So again, I don't really know how that fits with the rest of it, but that was something. And then finally, this kind of goes back to Aaron's question. So I was thinking about for education, for the education budget, like we think like, oh, yay, they're spending more money on education. That's so great. But, that might be, you're looking at this period from the 90s onwards where they are having the Safe Schools Act. I forget when that was passed, but it's like, hey, we're giving you federal money to buy metal detectors and to start doing drug testing and, hire security guards at the school. So it'd be really interesting if there was some way. I kept wanting to see like if you could break out just a couple of cities and do like a little case study of like what was going on those cities to try to figure out like, really what's going on kind of under the hood in a different way. So anyway, a variety of things. Please don't feel like you have to respond to all of them.
No, those are great points. Yeah, I mean, I'll start with the last one first. And sorry, my internet's having a little trouble, so if I drop out, my apologies. Yeah, if school spending was increasingly carceral and going towards things like metal detectors and security guards, then the trend I'm finding is actually a conservative estimate, right? It's an understatement that this transition from social services and education and towards policing might be even more dramatic than I've captured. So that's a great reason to see this as a conservative estimate. Yeah. As far as private security goes, yeah, I suspect it grew in tandem with policing. And as far as the how do local governments want to reallocate their money, they have less control over private security. But I think it's an interesting point, and I think one that doesn't get captured in official statistics. And so understanding, the amount of attention that residents are getting from security guards, both public and private, that might not be represented by the amount of spending that a city's doing. They might be getting hassled by private security guards for sure. Yeah, as far as this Garland argument that you're on your own, the police can only come in after the fact. Did the sovereign state argument, did he historically situate that in a certain time period?
Yeah, it was basically there's like that big crime increase. And so there's this kind of sense that the government can't do its job. It can't provide social services. It can't provide basically policing and stuff. So you're on your own. Everybody is going to be a victim of crime at this point. So you need to take the steps to do it. And so it was basically like 80s and 90s and that kind of shift to like target hardening of like that whole trend, and then responsibilization. And so now it's neoliberalism, basically. It's, like you have to buy the things that are going to keep you safe. So it was like 80s, 90s, I think, and then kind of as the start, and then it was just kind of continued after that.
Yeah, I mean, I think my graphs showing expansion of both social service and police spending might show that didn't translate into a retraction of government, right? And like I said earlier, these, for all the attempts that the right has made to cut back on welfare states spending, at least at the local level, it hasn't eliminated it completely, right? And so, I think that the target hardening, you're on your own kind of argument doesn't necessarily show, I would argue, doesn't necessarily show up in those data.
Thank you. Cameron.
Yeah, one thing I'm really curious about is also kind of situating this research in the context of like the demographic populations of some of these cities, because I know that the kind of the history of both our conversation around crime and safety and our conversation about welfare is deeply contoured by our history of white supremacy and racism. And so like knowing that like the concept of welfare queens is like weaponized to destroy, I even heard today someone talking about the resurgence of welfare queen language to talk about student loan debt, which blows my mind. That and the use of like the Willie Horton ads and kind of airing of these there's this rogue black element as part of like the call for more policing. I'm curious about I see the breakdown with Democrats and Republicans, but I'm also curious about Democrats in cities and in places with high populations of Black people versus ones that don't, because it is hard. I think it is, as someone stated earlier, it is hard to roll back police spending as a Democrat in general, but it's especially difficult to do that especially in Rust Belt cities, in places like Chicago and Detroit and Baltimore, because they're surrounded by white suburbs that are created during white flight that like basically will throw a fit if you do that. And so I'm curious about that situation. And the other thing I'm curious about is also about how we account for what I think is happening right now, which is that we are in a period of recovery after major, calamity from the pandemic. but the tides have kind of changed on how people feel about being a police officer. So in New Orleans in particular, which is where I'm situated in my work, we have, about 200, maybe 300 officers shortfall. And so we've had a $70 million surplus in our police budget for the last 3 years. And they're throwing another $37.5 million into trying to increase recruitment. They're trying to civilianize and add civilians into it to stabilize it. But the department's in free fall, and it's not unlike, it's not a unique situation. There's a major policing shortage. So I'm really curious about what you think this research has to say in knowing that we are in a situation of austerity, but there isn't actually unlike the 90s, they're not being a police officer isn't as popular as it once was.
Yeah. I mean, on the white supremacy point, the coefficient estimate for percent Black showed a positive relationship. When cities see an influx of Black people, they spend more on police, even controlling for crime. So I think you're absolutely right that part of this acceleration in police spending has to do with the fear of Black people and white supremacy. And my research is hardly the first to find this. It's one of the more consistent findings in policing research that arrests, spending, and stops all go up when cities get less white. Yeah, and as far as recruitment goes, I think that as cities struggle to hire cops, they're going to have to spend more money on overtime. They're going to spend money on recruitment. And so, I don't have any data to back this up, but just my own opinion is that the extent to which we can civilianize and which we can shift a lot of these police responsibilities for traffic enforcement and housing work and drug treatment and mental health response, to the extent we can transfer those off the books of the police and onto our social service functions, which are better equipped to handle those things, we'll be able to deal with this recruitment, and then police can investigate violent crime and stick to the stuff that they're specialists in. So yeah, I think both of these trends are really important to underline for sure.
Awesome. Okay, so I think we're about out of time. So if everyone can join me once more in a virtual round of applause for an excellent talk and a great Q&A.
Yeah, thanks all for those great questions. I've got a page of notes. I can't wait to incorporate them into the paper. So I really appreciate your thoughtfulness.